You weren't invited. That's what my father said, after 11 years of silence. No hug, no smile, just a chilled whisper in a room full of wine glasses and strangers. And just like that, the house I once called mine became their stage. They rewrote the story and left me out. But I didn't disappear. I remembered. I kept the truth. And when they pushed me out the front door, they forgot one thing. The deed was still in my name. If you've ever been erased from your own story, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, take a breath, for silence doesn't always mean surrender. I hadn't been back to Charleston in 5 years, not since I signed the papers that made me invisible. The air still smelled like sweet tea and cut grass. Late November in Charleston had a way of curling into your clothes, cool, crisp, with just enough warmth in the breeze to remind you the ocean wasn't far. I entered through the side gate, like an old caterer slipping in unnoticed, though my name had once been etched into the front step alongside my sister's. No one noticed the sound of the latch. No one turned to greet me. Marianne walked a step behind me, clutching her gift in both hands like a peace offering. I had warned her the evening would be complicated, but she insisted on coming. For moral support, she said. Or maybe she just wanted to see for herself the place I used to talk about with such reverence. I could still hear my grandmother's voice from years ago, curled like ivy in the back of my mind. People can pretend not to see you, but they can't ignore the deed to the land they're standing on. I laughed when she said it. I didn't understand then that she meant it as armor. Inside, nothing had changed. The same chandelier hung from the high-beamed ceiling, casting fractured rainbows across the hardwood. The same ivory wainscoting ran the walls. And in the center of it all, my father, Graham, stood with a glass of something golden in his hand, anchoring the room by force of posture alone. Mother stood beside him, her smile practiced, impeccable. When her gaze drifted across the room and landed on me, there was a pause, barely a heartbeat, and then nothing. She turned to greet a guest behind her, leaving me standing there, stitched back into the wallpaper. The table was overflowing. Pecan pies and cornbread, a silver tureen of gumbo, tiered trays of petit fours. I heard Eloise's laughter before I saw her, bright, clear, the kind of sound people turn toward like sunflowers to the sun. She wore Mother's old brooch. She never even glanced my way. Marianne touched my elbow gently. "Do you want to sit?" I shook my head. "Not yet." I drifted through the room like a ghost at her own funeral. Conversations floated around me. Law firms, baptisms, grandchildren's college plans. Nobody asked where I'd been. Nobody mentioned the trust fund that paid for tonight's venue. My name scrubbed from every plaque and program. The centerpiece of the room was a blown-up photograph, the Grahams and their legacy. Sepia-toned, glossy, full of staged joy. But I wasn't in it. My corner of the frame had been filled with an antique vase. I moved toward the back, where my grandmother sat beneath a painting of the old house by the river. Her fingers, delicate and veined, rested on her lap like folded linen. "You still remember this house," she said softly, without looking up. I smiled. I never forgot. She looked at me then, and for a moment, I wasn't erased. In the dining room, the toast began. My father raised his glass. To 50 years of love, legacy, and family. A cheer followed. Glasses clinked. Eloise dabbed the corner of her eye. And me? I was just a shape in the background. I sat in the last row of chairs, spine straight, hands resting in my lap like a schoolchild waiting to be called. I noticed then the napkins, folded in the shape of orchids, the same fold I used to make with my grandmother when I was 10. But this time, I hadn't folded them. Someone had kept the tradition, but without the one who started it. Near the fireplace, I saw the old grandfather clock still ticking, its pendulum swaying in time, with the music echoing faintly from the stereo. It had once been my job to wind it every Sunday, until it wasn't anymore. Until they stopped leaving the key in the drawer where I could find it. A little girl, maybe a cousin's child, wandered past me, holding a crayon scribble card. She looked up, blinked, and smiled before darting off again. It was the only acknowledgement I'd received all evening. At the back table, a woman asked who had arranged the venue. Someone answered, "The family did it all themselves." So thoughtful. I didn't correct her. On the wall behind the drink station, a framed needlepoint hung askew. It read, "Home is where the story begins." I stared at it a long time, wondering whose version of the story was hanging here now. Marianne nudged a small plate toward me. "Eat something," she murmured, but my stomach was too tight. Every flavor in this house had once meant comfort. Now it just tasted like forgetting. Marianne whispered, "Are you sure you want to stay this long?" I looked up at the photo. Long enough for them to remember who built the frame. "You weren't invited." That was the first thing my father said to me in over 11 years. He didn't shout. He didn't whisper it either. It was the kind of statement dropped like fine china. Soft, deliberate, and loud enough for the right people to hear. I had been on my way to leave early, coat in hand, when he intercepted me near the bar. Glass of white wine in one hand, elbow resting casually on the corner of the antique sideboard I'd restored myself back in college. That sideboard was mine, technically. Part of the house deed, part of the inheritance. But here it stood, claimed like everything else by the illusion of togetherness. "This is not your place anymore," he added, and took a sip. A woman nearby turned to her husband, whispering, "Is she the one who moved away?" She wasn't even discreet. I heard her clearly, and I think he meant for me to. I placed my coat back over my arm, breathed in slow, and looked my father in the eye. "Just to be clear," I said, voice steady, "are you asking me to leave?" He smiled. A politician's smile, warm for the cameras, sharp as a letter opener. Loudly enough. 3 seconds. That's how long the entire room went quiet. Glasses halfway to mouths, bites paused mid-air. Even the string quartet hesitated. Then the world resumed. Cutlery clinked. Conversation resumed. Only I was frozen. I turned and walked past the dessert table, where Eloise stood laughing with friends. Some new, some from the old neighborhood. She didn't look at me. Her laughter went on, too long and too bright, like someone trying to hide a crack in the glass. No one stopped me. Not even my mother. I saw her from the corner of my eye, still seated at the head table, fingers tightening around a napkin. Her eyes were fixed on the centerpiece. It was easier, I suppose, to look at roses than at daughters. Have you ever felt like the people who were supposed to protect you chose silence instead? That subtle sting when their eyes find anything but you. If you've ever stood invisible in a room you once called home, comment number 7 below. Now, let's see what happened next. The hallway was just as I remembered it. Long, narrow, slightly crooked. I had played hopscotch here as a child, using masking tape to mark the tiles. Back then, there was a little bench beneath the window. Gone now. The space had been refreshed, according to the party invite. Funny, how refreshing something often means erasing it. I stepped out into the cold, November air hit my cheeks like a slap. The grass, brittle underfoot, crunched as I crossed the yard. Spotlights cast gold across the lawn, making the house glow like a theater set. My family's grand production. And I was no longer part of the cast. I stopped halfway to the gate. This was my land. The house sat on a trust my grandmother created, and I was one of the named trustees, though no one had mentioned that fact tonight. The chandelier inside sparkled through the window, its crystals catching light, like the last remnants of a life that once felt like mine. I heard the door close behind me, someone coming out briefly before thinking better of it. Maybe they'd been sent to offer a weak apology or escort me off the premises, but even that dignity was denied. That's the thing about polite cruelty. It never wants a witness. The grass was damp beneath my shoes. I moved slowly across the lawn, fingers brushing the low-hanging branches of the old magnolia. Years ago, I buried a note there, scrawled in pink pen, "I want to be seen." It was childish, dramatic, and still, more honest than anything said at that party. Near the gate, the garden lights cast long shadows. I lingered in one of them. A fragment of music floated through the air, something from a string quartet, likely curated by Eloise. She'd always liked the appearance of elegance, even when there was no substance underneath. Marianne didn't press me. She stood a step away, patient, familiar with my silences. That was love, I realized. Not noise, not intervention. Just presence. I didn't need to be consoled. I needed to be witnessed. I ran my fingers along the iron gate, every ridge worn smooth by time and touch. The same gate they locked behind me once. The same gate I now held open, on my own terms. My grandmother hadn't said a word, but when I passed her table, her eyes found mine, soft and warm. A silent benediction, as if to say, "You know who you are now, don't you?" Marianne held out the car keys. "We can go?" But I didn't take them. Not yet. I kept looking toward the house, our house, and said, "There's one thing I haven't told them." They erased me, so I started writing my name. Again, and this time in ink. The morning after the anniversary party, the sky over Charleston wept in a light, steady drizzle. I watched droplets trail down the office window as I waited in Marianne's reception area. The walls were painted in warm oak, shelves lined with books that still bore gold-leaf titles. Quiet. Intentionally so. The kind of quiet that makes people believe important things are happening just behind the next door. For once, they were. Marianne opened the door herself. "They won't see it coming," she said. No preamble. Just that dry, knowing look that said we were past disbelief and well into action. She handed me a file folder, the one I'd asked for. The manila edges were slightly worn from years in storage, but the contents were precise. The handwritten will of Gwendolyn Carter, my grandmother, dated the year I turned 25, signed in ink, notarized, and witnessed by two names I still remembered from my childhood church. "Are you sure you want to open this door?" Marianne asked, settling into the seat across from me. I nodded. "They opened it first. I'm just walking through." She tapped her pen against the desk, then pushed the document toward me. I reread the words I already knew by heart. "To my granddaughter, Isolde Graham, I entrust the family home, known as the Carter House, in full ownership and right of use through trust, effective immediately. This decision reflects not only my love, but my faith in her vision and memory." Below it, in Gwendolyn's unmistakable hand, was a line that never failed to catch me. "You were never temporary." I exhaled. Marianne slid a set of updated legal forms across the desk. "Initial here and here. This confirms continuation of ownership and revokes temporary permissions for bookings made by third parties." I signed. My name felt more permanent this time, not a whisper of belonging. A declaration. We sent a simple email to the event company that had been used for the party. The owner has declined further bookings for this address. No explanations, no signatures, just finality. Then I drafted a notice of legal intent, an official letter that I didn't plan to send. Not yet. But I wanted it there, ready, like a line of defense drawn softly in the sand. Before leaving, I requested a scan of the original will and Gwendolyn's letter. I wanted to hold those words outside of memory. Marianne's assistant compiled without question, her face unreadable. But I noticed the way she tucked the letter into the folder, delicately, like it was sacred. Outside, I stood beneath the awning as the rain thickened. The city moved slowly in the wet, cars trailing water, pedestrians ducking beneath shared umbrellas. Charleston held its breath, or maybe that was just me. I pulled the copy of the letter from the folder again. Let my eyes rest on her handwriting. People don't need to see you to know you're there. Just make sure you never forget your own place, even when they pretend you don't have one. I knew what she meant now. Legacy wasn't about applause. It was about holding ground. The silence I chose wasn't surrender. It was architecture, building walls where they'd left their absence. Inside Marianne's office, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old books, a contrast to the storm within me, now settling into something more focused, sharper. I stayed there longer than I meant to, standing by the window, listening to the rain tap out a rhythm I hadn't noticed in years. It sounded like the piano lessons I once took in that house, hesitant, uneven, but persistent. I used to play in the afternoons, when no one else was home, when I believed someone might walk by and hear me and say nothing, but still stop and listen. My hands clenched the folder now, like sheet music, too precious to let fall. Marianne stepped back in briefly to ask if I needed anything, but I just shook my head. Some silences are invitations. Others are answers. I glanced again at the corner of the letter. Her signature, curved, flowing, confident. It reminded me of the way she held my hand in church when I was little, her fingers always tracing small circles into my palm, like punctuation to prayers, like memory etched into skin. That day I didn't cry. Not out of strength, but out of something firmer. Resolve, maybe, or recognition. I finally understood what it meant to belong to something and to someone, even when they no longer claimed you. I tucked the papers into my coat, stepped into the rain without an umbrella, and let it wash over me as I crossed the street. The city blurred, but I felt sharper, more permanent, less ghost, more ink. On her desk, I saw a property map of Charleston, a collection of shaded lots and numbered squares. My fingers found the one that mattered, the Carter House. I circled it with a pen, and I whispered, "You will remember me by the silence that follows." I thought silence would be enough, but silence doesn't protect you from stories told in your absence. I wasn't planning on seeing anyone that morning. I'd gone to the cafe near the shoreline, a place where I used to waitress during my college years, before any of the silence. Before my name became a cautionary tale or worse. Forgotten altogether. The sea breeze still smelled the same, salt and wet pine, with the faintest trace of roasted espresso slipping out the door every time someone left. I was stirring cream into my coffee when I heard a voice say, "Isolde?" It took me a second to recognize Cressida, a second cousin on my father's side. We hadn't spoken in more than a decade, but she looked at me with the same open curiosity she always had. "I thought you were living in Europe," she said, sliding into the seat across from me before I could respond. I blinked. "Europe?" She laughed lightly. "That's what I heard. Something about you running off after college with a professor or something. Bit of a scandal, and then nothing. No one seemed to know where you went. I've been here, I said, in South Carolina, working. The words didn't come out defensive, just weary, like I'd said them before, to myself. She tilted her head, genuinely surprised. Well, that's not what the family says. And there it was, the story written in my absence. We chatted a little longer, small things, weather, books. When she left, she gave me a hug, said it was nice to see me, and promised to keep in touch. But I stayed there long after she was gone, staring at the dregs in my cup, wondering just how many versions of me existed in other people's mouths. Back at home, I pulled open the old cedar box I kept in the hallway closet. Inside were stacks of letters from my grandmother, real ink, real paper, spanning years. One of them included her handwritten instructions for the legal transfer of the house. I reread every word, every loop in her cursive, like tracing memory itself. Beneath the letters was my journal, leather-bound and scarred. I turned to a page marked with a yellowing post-it, the day we signed the certification. "You are the continuity," she had told me that night, handing me the pen. "No matter what they say." Later that evening, I called Marianne. Her voice was calm, steady. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so," I replied. "But I need to ask you something." "Of course. If I write something, not legal, not official, just my truth, can you look at it? Help me say it right?" There was a pause. "Do you want truth?" she asked. "Or do you want closure?" "I'm not sure there's a difference anymore." That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the old one with the scratched corner from where Eloise once slammed her trigonometry book. The house was still, the kind of silence that felt filled, not empty. I lit a candle, opened a new document on my laptop, and stared at the blinking cursor. My fingers hovered for a long time before I started typing. This house was not built on legacy. It was built on erasure. I stared at the sentence. I didn't hit a save. Not yet. I looked up at the mantel where, all those years ago, a single wrapped box sat forgotten one Christmas morning. I was 16. Everyone else's gifts had been passed around, paper flying, laughter bouncing against the walls. Mine stayed there, unclaimed. Later, I opened it quietly, alone in my room. It was empty. I hadn't thought of that morning in years. But tonight, it came back like a whisper, an echo of the kind of silence that cuts deepest, not absence, but dismissal. I returned to my document, added a new line. My story isn't loud, but it's mine, and it deserves to be told. Outside, the waves kept breaking. Inside, I wrote like someone coming back to life. Before closing my laptop, I took a deep breath and opened the drawer beneath the table. Inside, I kept a bundle of old photographs, the kind we once mailed to each other before texts and group chats replaced memory. One photo caught my eye. It was from the 4th of July, years ago. I was maybe 11 or 12, wearing a red dress instead of the pale blue everyone else had been instructed to wear. No one told me about the family palette. I'd spent the evening outside, behind the bushes, watching the fireworks alone. I traced the edge of the photo, not with bitterness, but something softer. Sorrow, maybe, or clarity. They had always wanted a portrait family, framed, filtered, folded neatly into expectations. I had always been the creased corner they tried to flatten, and now I had the pen. I returned to the document, added one final sentence for the night. What they remember may not be the truth, but I will no longer apologize for remembering fully. And then, finally, I hit save. Some people come home to heal. I came back to make sure they didn't rewrite me out of the will of memory. I wrote the letters by hand. Not because I was nostalgic, but because truth deserves to be held, not scrolled past like an ad. Each page carried the quiet cadence of my voice, unmarred by formatting or tone misread through screens. I told them what no one had bothered to ask. Who sat beside grandmother Gwendolyn in her final weeks? Who brought her tea with lemon, even when her hands trembled too hard to hold the cup? Who read her the same paragraph 3 times until her breath slowed enough to sleep? I mailed the envelopes with deliberate slowness, each address in the neat script she once taught me at the dining table, the same table where I was later made invisible. Graham returned his, unopened, but with the delivery receipt signed, precisely the kind of gesture I expected. Judith said nothing, but 3 days later, I found a small package at my door. No note, just a photograph of me and grandmother, seated on the porch steps. I was 7. She wore her garden apron and a sun hat too big for her face. Wrapped inside was a handkerchief, soft and yellowing with age. My name was stitched into one corner, this time spelled right. I sat with it for hours. I had never wanted vengeance, only memory, accurate and unafraid. Their silence wasn't refusal. It was absent, masquerading as restraint. Later that week, I visited the cemetery. November had sharpened the wind. Dry leaves scraped across the grass like old pages turning themselves. I brought no flowers, only the final copy of my letter. I read it aloud beside her grave, slow and steady, not because I needed her to hear it, but because she always had. I wasn't the loudest, I whispered, but I stayed, and I remembered. That was all I had ever hoped someone would say of me. The ache in my chest wasn't grief. It was a space I had made peace with, carved out by years of standing just beyond the frame, now filled by the weight of my own truth. As I rose, the wind lifted my coat hem, brushing it against the stone. I ran my fingers along her name, then reached into my bag and pulled out the deed to the house. The original, signed, dated, preserved. Not just mine, but hers and ours, in every quiet way that mattered. I had told them, not for them, but for me. That evening, I called Marianne. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. Now, this house finally belongs to someone who sees invisible women. Have you ever chosen to walk away, not out of defeat, but out of clarity? That quiet strength in giving something back on your own terms. If you've ever found power in letting go, comment number 9 below. Let's see how the story ends. The papers would be filed the next morning. The house, not theirs anymore, would shelter women like Gwendolyn. Women like me. Before bed, I stepped onto the porch of my rental, trimmed with the last of the hydrangeas. I touched the petals, browned slightly at the edges, but still soft. I remembered grandmother's voice the first summer I helped her plant them. We pick the flowers we think are delicate, but they last the whole season. She hadn't been talking about hydrangeas. She had been talking about me. The next morning, I woke early, unsettled by a dream that vanished as soon as I opened my eyes. I made coffee the way she taught me, strong but not bitter, and sipped it while rereading the final lines of my letter. There was no rage left, just the hollow echo of being excluded from a story I helped build. It's strange how grief clings to places. Door frames, window ledges, corners of rugs where bare feet once shuffled. My house was full of such memories, yet they had tried to turn it into a theater for their own legacy. But not anymore. I found the scarf she'd given me the winter I moved out, navy wool, tucked at the back of my drawer. I wrapped it around my shoulders as I walked to the mailbox, my breath fogging in the morning air. I mailed the final packet, addressed not to family, but to the nonprofit I had chosen. A note enclosed read, "This house held generations of silence. Let it now hold its voice." On the walk back, I passed the florist shop, where she once bought a single lily every Sunday. I stepped in and bought one for myself. No occasion, no apology, just a way of saying, "I remember." That evening, as I folded the scarf and placed it back in the drawer, I thought of all the things I hadn't said in my letter, not because they weren't true, but because truth doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, it's enough that it exists, like the quiet creak of floorboards under familiar feet, or the way light touches the same corner of the room year after year. I didn't need them to respond. I only needed to stop waiting for them to. I didn't come back to break them. I came back to unbreak myself. The winter air along the coast held a kind of stillness I hadn't known I needed. My new place was small, 2 rooms and a porch that faced the sea. The kind of house where silence felt earned, not imposed. I unpacked a little, just enough to live, and enough to begin again. One of the first things I placed was a small photograph, me and my grandmother, heads bent together over a bowl of biscuit dough. I put it on the kitchen shelf near the window. It didn't need a frame or spotlight, just presence. Mrs. Tolliver, my neighbor, had introduced herself with a basket of oranges and a warm, curious smile. She'd lived alone since her husband passed and didn't pry. We started baking together once a week, her way of checking in, mine of staying grounded. She said my tea reminded her of her daughters, and that was the first time in years someone said I reminded them of family. Days passed like waves, quiet, steady, with a rhythm that gave me space to remember without bleeding. Then came the letter. It arrived folded neatly, addressed by hand. Inside was a thank you, from a young woman who now lived in the house I had given away. She wrote, "I don't know who you are, but I know what you saw. You saw women like us. Thank you for not looking away." I cried, just a little, because someone had seen me too. Mary Ann came by with a cardboard box filled with old files I hadn't had the courage to sort before. We didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, we sat on the porch, sipping coffee, watching gulls dip across the water like paper kites. She said, "You don't look like someone who's holding on anymore." "I'm not," I said. "I'm writing now. Finally." Each morning, I took a few minutes to write down a memory, nothing dramatic, just the truth, the kind that held up like hydrangeas in summer heat. I wrote about the time I danced alone in the hallway while everyone prepared the turkey and no one noticed. About Christmas, I unwrapped a present that had no tag, because it was never meant for me. The wind had a way of brushing past without taking anything with it. One morning, I sat by the shore with my notebook. The pages fluttered in the breeze like they too had waited to breathe. I was not the lost daughter. I was the quiet survivor. I folded the page and placed it into my memory box, alongside the scarf with the misspelled name. I ran my fingers over the old embroidery, threadbare but intact. And then I smiled. They told their version. Now, here's mine. That afternoon, I walked the narrow path behind the house, lined with windswept grasses and driftwood. My hands tucked in the sleeves of an old wool sweater I hadn't worn since college. Back then, it smelled like dorm hallways and hope. Now it smelled of salt and pine. I stopped at a bend where the shore met the rocks and listened. It wasn't just the tide speaking. It was memory, reshaping itself with every crest and pull. I thought of Judith, my mother, and the gift she left. I hadn't opened it again since the day I found it on my porch, wrapped carefully, too carefully, in neutral paper. The photo of me and my grandmother, and the handkerchief stitched in coral thread. Isolde, spelled right. Not an apology, but not denial either. A strange middle place. Like maybe she remembered, too late. I wondered if she'd looked at that scarf and finally saw the girl she once named. There were moments, quiet, flickering moments, where I nearly picked up the phone to ask about her hands, if they ached the way mine did when rain was coming, to tell her the gardenias I planted out front were blooming out of season, stubborn and white like ghosts. But I didn't call. I couldn't make silence into a bridge, only a boundary. Mrs. Tolliver once asked me, gently, "Do you miss them?" I told her the truth. I miss what I pretended we were. She nodded, like she knew that answer in her own bones. I spent that evening writing, not to publish, not to share, just to remember fully. Memory, I was learning, wasn't about holding on. It was about setting things down where they wouldn't rot. My last page that night simply read, "She didn't leave quietly. She just found a quieter place." I tucked it into the box. Later, before sleep, I opened the window wide. The sea was dark, the stars faint, but there was a peace in the air I hadn't earned before. Now I had. And I whispered to the wind just once, "I remember me." In the morning, I brewed tea and stood barefoot on the porch, steam curling from the cup. The tide was coming in. I smiled, not because everything had healed, but because I had. And that was enough. Some silences are survival. I didn't speak to be heard. I spoke to remember myself. What I've learned is that truth, once found, doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand. Forgiveness didn't come like thunder. It arrived gently, like morning light brushing worn wood. If this story made you pause, perhaps you'd like to hear more. Subscribe if you feel called to. There's always another story waiting. Thank you for listening. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.